His wife forced him out of his own home so her ex could move in. And she did it on a Sunday, in front of her mother, in front of her aunts, with a smile on her face like she was doing him a favor. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man they'd spent 4 years treating like a background character had quietly signed his name to everything that mattered. The house they were living in, the home her mother was counting on to fund her retirement, every wall, every room, every plan they had for the future, all of it was resting on a foundation they had never once thought to look at. He didn't argue, he didn't beg. He picked up one bag, walked to the hall table, and took a single envelope on his way out the door. That envelope changed everything. What happens when the man you humiliated in front of your entire family turns out to be the only reason your world was standing in the first place? And what happens when he finally decides, quietly, legally, and without a single raised voice, to take it all back? If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now because we post stories like this every week and you do not want to miss what's coming. If you've been rocking with us, you already know. Drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps more than you know. And tell me where you're watching from today. Drop your city in the comments right now. We've got people tuning in from everywhere and I want to see where you're joining us from. Now let me take you all the way back to where this started. A Sunday evening in Memphis, a dinner table full of people who had already made up their minds, and a quiet man who walked out of his own home, carrying the one thing nobody thought to ask about. The house on Pembroke Lane smelled like it always did on Sunday evenings. Pot roast in the slow cooker, Constance's perfume cutting through everything else like a warning, and something underneath it all that Nate had never been able to name but had learned, over 4 years, to recognize. It meant company was coming. It meant performance was required. It meant Nate Cross needed to be careful about how much space he took up. He had changed out of his church clothes and was setting the table when Priya came downstairs in a fresh dress, her hair still pinned, her lipstick touched up. That detail alone should have told him something. You didn't refresh your lipstick for a Sunday dinner you'd already been sitting through. You refreshed it for something you were about to do. Constance arrived at 5 with Priya's 2 aunts, Renata and Beverly, trailing behind her like a chorus. There were hugs, there were compliments about the centerpiece Priya had ordered online and placed like it was something she'd arranged herself, and there was the particular silence that fell over the room whenever Nate spoke. Not rude, exactly, but present. The kind of silence that reminded him every time that this gathering was not his. He passed the rolls, he refilled glasses, he asked Beverly about her knee and listened to the full answer. He was good at this, being present without requiring anything. He had learned it early in this family because the alternative was conflict, and Nate Cross did not do conflict at the dinner table. It was Constance who set down her fork first. She looked at Priya with an expression Nate had seen before. The slight nod, the pressed lips, the look of a woman giving permission, and Priya straightened in her chair like a student who'd just been called on. "I need to talk to you about something," Priya said. She wasn't looking at Nate when she said it. She was looking at her plate. He waited. "Winston is coming back to Memphis." She said it the way people announce weather, matter of fact, already decided. He's going through something right now and he needs somewhere stable to land. I told him he could stay here for a while. The table did not react. That was the tell. Renata reached for her water glass with the calm of someone who already knew where the story was going. Beverly smoothed her napkin. Constance sat with her hands folded like a woman at a closing ceremony. They had been told, all of them, before Nate had heard a single word. Winston Nate said. "He's just a friend, Nate. He's having a hard time." Winston Beaumont was not just a friend. Winston Beaumont was the man Priya had dated for 3 years before Nate, the man whose name still appeared in the margins of old photographs she kept in a shoebox in the top of the closet, the man she got quiet about whenever his name came up in conversation. Nate had never made an issue of it because he trusted his wife. He had spent 4 years trusting his wife. "There's plenty of room," Priya continued. "You can use the guest room while he gets settled. It won't be long." The guest room, in his own home. Nate looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Constance, who was now studying the centerpiece with great interest. He looked at Renata and Beverly, who were both suddenly very focused on their food. He understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that this was not a conversation. This was a notification. The decision had been made in rooms he hadn't been invited into, and everyone at this table had known about it before he sat down to eat. He put his napkin on the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask another question. He stood up from the table with the same steadiness he brought to everything, the same quiet that Constance had spent 4 years mistaking for submission, and he walked upstairs. He was back in 4 minutes with a duffel bag, a change of clothes, his toiletries, his laptop, his chargers. He moved through the house the way he moved through most things, efficiently, without waste. In the entryway, on the hall table, sat a manila envelope. He had left it there 2 weeks ago after pulling some paperwork on a refinancing inquiry he'd been looking into, and then set aside. Priya had never asked about it. He had never explained it. It had just sat there, unremarkable, between the mail basket and the ceramic dish where they dropped their keys. He picked it up, not urgently, not with any particular intention. He just picked it up the way you pick up anything that belongs to you on your way out the door. He didn't look back at the table. He heard Constance's voice follow him down the hall, smooth and final as a gavel. "Priya, you deserve to be happy, baby. You always have." Nate opened the front door. Winston's silver Audi was turning into the driveway, headlights sweeping across the front of the house like a spotlight. Nate stepped past it onto the sidewalk, duffel over one shoulder, envelope in his hand, and kept walking. The humiliation was complete. Every person at that table had made sure of it. But the envelope, the one nobody had noticed, the one nobody had thought to ask about, was going with him. To understand what happened to Nate Cross, you have to understand what kind of man he was before any of it started. Nate had grown up in Orange Mound, the kind of neighborhood that taught you early that nobody was coming to hand you anything. His mother worked doubles at the hospital. His father coached youth football on weekends and drove a delivery truck during the week. They were not wealthy people, but they were serious people, the kind of family where you showed up on time, you kept your word, and you did not make a public spectacle of your problems. Nate had carried those lessons into everything he touched. By 34, he was the athletic director at Whitehaven High School, managing a department of 7 coaches, coordinating schedules across 6 varsity sports, and running a Saturday morning open gym at the community rec center that drew 40 kids every week without fail. He drove a clean, older model truck, kept a savings account he added to every month without exception, and owned exactly 2 good suits, one for funerals, one for everything else. He was not the kind of man who talked about what he had. He was the kind of man who simply had it, quietly, and kept building. The Holloways were a different kind of people entirely. They lived in a brick colonial on Shady Grove Road in East Memphis, in a neighborhood where the lawns were maintained, with a seriousness that bordered on competitive. Constance Holloway had cultivated her social standing the way some women cultivate a garden, with constant attention, careful pruning, and a ruthless eye for anything that might diminish the overall appearance. She sat on 2 charitable boards, hosted a spring garden party every April that her circle treated like an annual obligation, and spoke about her daughter with the proprietary pride of a woman who considered Priya her finest achievement. Priya had grown up understanding that the Holloway name meant something. She was polished, quick-witted, and effortlessly charming in rooms full of people whose approval she wanted. She had married Nate when she was 31, and somewhere in the back of Constance's mind, that fact had never fully settled right. The small humiliations began almost immediately. At the first family gathering Nate attended as Priya's husband, Constance introduced him to her neighbor as Priya's husband. He works over at one of the schools. Not his name, not his title, just a general category of employment, delivered with the warm blankness of someone describing a household appliance. Nate had smiled, shaken the neighbor's hand, and let it pass. He told himself it was nerves, that she was still adjusting, that these things took time. They did not improve with time. At Christmas, when Nate gave Priya a weekend trip she'd been asking about for months, Constance had looked at the card, nodded once, and then spent 10 minutes telling the room about the diamond bracelet Priya's college roommate's husband had given his wife that year. At Easter dinner, when someone asked what Nate did, Constance answered before he could. He runs the sports program at a high school, and then redirected the conversation so smoothly that no one noticed the redirect. At Priya's birthday, she thanked every person in the room by name, looked briefly in Nate's direction, and moved on. Nate was not invisible. He was deliberately made irrelevant. And yet he stayed. He stayed because he loved his wife, and because he was not a man who walked away from things when they got uncomfortable. He brought honesty and consistency to that marriage the way he brought it to everything else, without announcement, without expecting applause. Winston Beaumont was a name Nate had encountered exactly 3 times in the first 2 years of marriage. Once in an old photo he'd found in a shoebox while helping Priya reorganize the closet. A tall man in a college sweatshirt, standing close to Priya in the way people stood before they learned to leave space. Once, when Priya's phone buzzed late and she picked it up, glanced at the screen and set it face down without a word. Once when Renata mentioned him at a family dinner and Priya changed the subject so quickly that the sentence Renata had been forming just evaporated, unfinished, into the air. Nate noticed. He was not oblivious, but he was committed to the marriage and to the woman he believed his wife was, and so he filed those observations in a place he rarely visited and kept showing up. About 18 months before that Sunday dinner, something shifted in Priya that Nate could feel, but not name. She stopped asking about his day. She started spending more evenings on her phone, in the bedroom, with the door half closed. She was physically present at dinner, but somewhere else entirely, her attention thin and distant like a radio station losing its signal. She stopped laughing at the things she used to laugh at. She started sighing in a way that made Nate feel like his presence was an inconvenience she was managing. He kept cooking, he kept showing up to her family events, he kept paying half the bills on a house where he increasingly felt like a guest. 4 years of that. 4 years of being the most dependable man in the room and the least acknowledged one. 4 years of covering costs, keeping peace, and absorbing small cruelties with the patience of a man who genuinely believed that love required endurance. He had been right about the endurance. He had not yet understood what the endurance was actually preparing him for. What no one at that table knew, not Priya, not Constance, not Renata or Beverly, was why Nate's name appeared where it did on a document locked in a bank's record system on Goodlet Farms Parkway, and what that name, in that position, was about to mean for all of them. He slept on Darnell's couch that night without telling Darnell much of anything. His cousin had taken one look at him standing in the doorway with a duffel bag and an envelope, stepped back to let him in, and heated up a plate of leftover rice and chicken without asking a single question. That was Darnell. A man who understood that some things needed space before they needed words. Nate ate, he showered. He lay on that couch in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling while the neighborhood settled into quiet around him, and he did not open the envelope that night. He set it on the coffee table and left it there like something that needed to wait until he was ready to look at it clearly. Monday morning came grey and cool. Darnell had already left for a job site by the time Nate woke up. The apartment was still, the only sound a gospel station playing low from the clock radio Darnell kept on the kitchen counter. The same kind his mother used to keep, the kind that felt like a habit passed down rather than a choice made. Nate made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window for a while, watching a man walk his dog down the block below, moving unhurried through the morning, like nothing in the world required urgency. Then he sat down at the table and opened the envelope. The documents inside were straightforward. 2 pages from the refinancing inquiry he'd initiated several weeks ago, pulled together by a loan officer at First Tennessee Bank who had sent them over as part of a preliminary review. Nate had glanced at them when they arrived, set them on the hall table, and gotten distracted by the week ahead. He had never sat down and read them the way he was reading them now. The summary sheet was at the top. Primary borrower, Nate A. Cross. Not co-borrower, not secondary applicant, primary. Nate read it twice. Then he set the page down flat on the table and sat with that information for a long moment, because the full weight of what it meant had not arrived all at once. It came in stages, like pressure building behind a door. The house on Goodlet Farms Parkway. The Holloway family home. The address on Constance's stationery and the backdrop of every garden party and the foundation of everything she had ever performed for her social circle. That house existed in its current form because of a refinancing application filed 4 years ago with Nate's name in the primary borrower field. His credit score, his income documentation, his signature given without hesitation because his wife had asked him with tears in her eyes and he had loved her. He picked up his phone and called Calvin Dreyer. Calvin was a mortgage and family law attorney Nate had met 3 years earlier through the athletic booster program at the high school, the kind of man who showed up to every fundraiser, wrote a check every time, and never made a production of it. He was precise, unhurried, and utterly without drama, which was exactly what Nate needed that morning. Calvin's assistant put the call through inside of 2 minutes, and Calvin told him to come in at 10. Nate was there at 9:55. Calvin's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Madison Avenue, downtown, with a view of the Mississippi that Nate had no attention for that morning. He sat across from Calvin's desk, set the refinancing documents on the surface between them, and explained what had happened in the same calm, factual way he described situations to coaches and administrators. No performance, no editorializing, just the sequence of events in order. Calvin listened without interrupting. Then he pulled the documents toward him and read them the same way Nate had, carefully, thoroughly, with the specific attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. Then Calvin asked for the lease agreement on the Pembroke Lane property. Nate hadn't thought to bring it, but Calvin had a property research service pull it within 20 minutes. What came back was illuminating. 3 years earlier, when Nate and Priya had moved into the Cordova rental, Priya's application had been flagged by the management company due to a credit inquiry that had temporarily suppressed her score. The solution, handled quickly and without much ceremony, had been for Nate to sign the lease as the sole primary leaseholder. Priya had been added to the household informally, on a secondary form that carried no legal standing as a lease party. Her name was on a document, but not on the lease. Calvin turned his monitor so Nate could see the screen. He pointed to paragraph 11, subclause B. No additional occupants may be introduced to the premises without the express written consent of the primary leaseholder. Nate read it once. Winston Beaumont had moved into that house 4 days ago. He had no written consent from anyone with legal standing to give it, because the only person with legal standing was Nate, and Nate had not been asked. Calvin then walked him through the mortgage clause, reading it from the original refinancing agreement with the precision of a man who had seen this kind of language 100 times. Any change in the marital status of the primary borrower triggers a mandatory loan review, with the lending institution retaining the right to reassess all terms. 2 separate documents, 2 separate clauses, 2 mechanisms, each capable of causing serious, irreversible disruption on its own. Calvin leaned back in his chair. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at Nate with the steady expression of a man delivering a technical assessment and nothing more. "You have 2 separate legal mechanisms here," he said. "You only need to decide which one to use first." Nate looked at the documents spread across Calvin's desk. He looked at the lease. He looked at the mortgage summary with his name printed plainly at the top. He looked up at Calvin. "Use both," he said. Calvin did not rush him. That was the thing Nate appreciated most about the man. He understood that precision required time, and that a plan assembled in panic was a plan full of holes. After Nate said what he said, Calvin simply nodded, pulled a fresh legal pad from his desk drawer, and uncapped his pen like a man settling in for work he found genuinely interesting. They spent the rest of Monday morning mapping it out. The sequence mattered. Calvin explained it the way he explained everything. Clearly, without drama, walking Nate through each step the way a surgeon describes an incision before making it. The lease violation was the first move because it was the fastest. Property management companies were not courts. They did not require lengthy proceedings. A formal notice citing unauthorized occupant and lease violation, submitted by the sole named leaseholder with the relevant clause referenced, was sufficient to initiate removal proceedings within 72 hours. Winston Beaumont would be the first domino to fall, and he would fall quickly. The divorce filing was the second move, and the deeper one. Calvin pulled up the refinancing agreement on his screen and walked Nate through the marital status clause one more time, reading it slowly so there was no ambiguity about what it triggered. The moment Nate filed for divorce, first, Tennessee Bank's compliance system would flag the change in the primary borrower's status and initiate a mandatory review of the loan. The Holloways would be notified. Their ability to sell, refinance, or transact on the property in any way would be frozen pending the outcome of that review. And Calvin had already identified something else. A discrepancy in the original refinancing application involving a rental property the Holloways had listed as additional income. That property, Calvin had confirmed through county records, carried a lien that had not been disclosed. The application, as submitted 4 years ago, contained a material inaccuracy. That was not just a legal complication. That was a compliance referral waiting to happen, too. Both filings on the same day, Calvin said. Wednesday morning. Lease notice first, divorce papers second, joint account freeze third, all within the same business window, none of them carrying Nate's name in any publicly visible way in the initial paperwork. Nate went back to Darnell's that evening and sat on the couch with the television off. Darnell was in the kitchen frying fish, the radio low, the smell of seasoned cornmeal filling the apartment the way it used to fill his mother's house on Friday evenings. There was something grounding about that, something that reminded Nate of who he was before any of this. Before the Holloways, before the garden parties, before 4 years of being introduced as a category rather than a name. Darnell brought him a plate and sat in the armchair across from him. He looked at Nate for a moment. "You good?" he asked. "Getting there," Nate said. Darnell nodded once and turned toward the television. That was the full extent of the conversation, and it was exactly enough. Tuesday, Nate went to work. He ran a department meeting at 8, reviewed fall scheduling with 2 of his coaches, and handled a facilities dispute between the soccer program and the track team with the same measured efficiency he brought to everything. His colleagues noticed nothing different about him. There was nothing different to notice. He ate lunch at his desk, responded to emails, and drove back to Darnell's at 5:30. He did not call Priya. He did not text her. He did not reach out to Constance or Renata or Beverly or anyone connected to that household. He posted nothing. He said nothing to his co-workers, nothing to his mother when she called Tuesday evening to check in. He told her he was fine, that things were busy, that he would come by for Sunday dinner soon. She seemed satisfied with that, and he let her be. Silence was part of the plan. Wednesday morning, Nate was in Calvin's office at 8:15. Calvin had both documents prepared and laid them out on the desk in order. The formal notice to Cordova Properties Management Group was on top. 2 pages, precise language, citing paragraph 11, subclause B of the lease agreement, and requesting the removal of Winston Beaumont as an unauthorized occupant within the legally required 72-hour window. Below that were the divorce filing papers for the Shelby County Circuit Court. Nate read both documents in full. He asked 2 questions, both of which Calvin answered in under a minute. Then he signed. Calvin submitted the lease notice to the property management company's legal inbox at 9:02 in the morning. He filed the divorce papers with the court at 9:17. At 9:40, Nate authorized the freeze on his contributions to the joint checking account he shared with Priya. The account she used for household expenses, the one his direct deposit had been funding every 2 weeks for 4 years without interruption. By 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, Nate was back in his truck, driving through downtown Memphis with the windows down and nothing on the radio. 2 separate legal processes were now moving simultaneously through official channels, building momentum in the background like weather gathering outside of town. Priya was at work. Constance was presumably planning her next garden party or calling her realtor, or sitting comfortably in a house held together by a name she hadn't thought about in years. Neither of them had any idea what Wednesday had just put in motion. The first letter would arrive Thursday morning. Cordova Properties Management Group sent it by certified mail to the Pembroke Lane address, addressed to the current occupant of record. The letter cited paragraph 11, subclause B of the lease agreement. It named Winston Beaumont as an unauthorized occupant. It gave 72 hours for voluntary departure before formal removal proceedings would be initiated. It was 2 pages, it was precise, it was unstoppable. Priya called the property management company within the hour. The woman on the phone was polite and unhelpful in equal measure. She confirmed the notice was valid. She confirmed it had been submitted by the primary leaseholder. She confirmed that Priya's name did not appear on the lease in any legally binding capacity. She recommended Priya consult an attorney if she had questions about the process. Priya did not have questions about the process. She had questions about her husband. But Nate did not answer his phone. Winston took stock of the situation with the instincts of a man who had always known, somewhere underneath the linen shirts and the curated confidence, that Memphis was a temporary arrangement. By Thursday evening he had made several phone calls. By Friday morning he had packed 2 suitcases and loaded them into the silver Audi. He told the one mutual friend he bothered to contact that he had decided Memphis was not really where he needed to be right now, that he had some opportunities worth exploring elsewhere, that the timing just had not worked out. He left before noon. Nobody came to see him off. He was gone. That was domino 2. Friday afternoon, first, Tennessee Bank's loan review system processed the divorce filing and flagged the primary borrower status change on the Goodlet Farms Parkway mortgage. A letter went out to the property address the same day. Constance received it Saturday morning. It informed her that due to a change in the marital status of the primary borrower, a mandatory review of the loan had been initiated per the terms of the original refinancing agreement. During the review period, no sale, transfer, or refinancing of the property could proceed without written consent from the primary borrower. The review was expected to take 30 to 45 business days. Constance read it 3 times. She called her realtor. Her realtor called the bank. The bank confirmed everything the letter had said and added that the primary borrower had not yet responded to their outreach. The realtor, a woman who had been in Memphis real estate for 22 years and had seen most things, told Constance gently that the listing would need to be paused until the matter was resolved. Constance hung up and sat in the kitchen of the Goodlet Farms Parkway home in complete silence. Then the audit findings arrived. The bank's review had flagged a discrepancy in the original refinancing application. Specifically, a rental property listed as unencumbered supplemental income that, according to county records, carried a lien that had not been disclosed at the time of application. The bank's compliance division had been notified, a formal inquiry had been opened, a demand letter was issued to Constance Holloway personally, requiring a written response within 21 business days and outlining the potential financial penalties associated with a material inaccuracy on a federally backed loan application. That was domino 4. Constance called her attorney on a Sunday. That alone told you everything about how she felt. Meanwhile, Calvin's team was moving through the divorce asset discovery process with the methodical efficiency of people who had been given a complete picture and knew exactly where to look. The joint checking account records came back clean except for one transaction, a transfer of $22,000 executed 6 weeks before the Sunday dinner from the joint account to a personal account in the name of Winston Beaumont. Priya had authorized it. Calvin documented it. It went into the filing. Priya found out about the documentation the same week. She found out Winston had used the money to lease a car and fund a vacation to Puerto Rico that he had taken, apparently, while still telling her he was struggling financially. She found out through a text from a woman who had seen the photos. She sat in the Pembroke Lane house alone because Winston was gone and Nate was not coming back, and she looked at the joint account statement that Calvin's office had formally requested, and she understood, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, what she had done and what she had lost. Constance's realtor officially withdrew the listing that same week. The $280,000 in equity Constance had been planning around, the retirement she had quietly designed and never once mentioned to Nate because it had never occurred to her that Nate was relevant to it, was frozen, inaccessible, dependent entirely on a man she had spent 4 years dismissing. Priya had no Winston, no joint account, no legal standing in the house she was living in, no plan. Constance had no sale, no retirement fund, a demand letter, an attorney on a Sunday retainer. Constance called Priya on a Wednesday evening. The phone rang 4 times before Priya picked up, and for the first time in 4 years of Sunday dinners and garden parties and quiet coordinated cruelties, Constance Holloway had absolutely nothing to say that could fix anything. The silence between them was enormous. Constance demanded a meeting. Calvin, when Nate relayed the request, allowed it. He scheduled it for the following week in his conference room on the 14th floor. Nate said fine. He had been waiting 4 years to be in a room where his name meant exactly what it was worth. Calvin's conference room was on the 14th floor, quiet and clean, with a long oval table and 4 chairs arranged with the kind of neutral precision that said this room had witnessed many difficult conversations and taken sides in none of them. There was a water pitcher in the center. There were legal pads at each seat. The Memphis skyline sat in the window behind Calvin's chair like a backdrop that had nothing to say about any of this. Nate arrived first. He always arrived first. He sat down, straightened the legal pad in front of him that he had no intention of writing on, and folded his hands on the table. Calvin sat to his right, a thin folder open in front of him, reading glasses on, expression composed. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Priya arrived 7 minutes later. She came in wearing a blazer she reserved for professional settings, her hair pulled back, her posture careful. She sat across from Nate and did not look at him directly. She looked at the water pitcher, she looked at Calvin. She looked at her hands. She was quieter than Nate had expected, and he understood, watching her settle into the chair, that she had spent the last 2 weeks learning things she had not known before. The silence around her was not defiance. It was the specific stillness of a person who had already started to understand what was coming. Constance arrived 3 minutes after that. She had not been invited. Calvin had not scheduled her. She came in behind Priya like a woman who had never once in her life required an invitation to enter a room, and she sat down in the chair beside her daughter with the full composure of someone who believed her presence alone shifted the balance of any situation she entered. She set her purse on the table. She smoothed the front of her blazer. She looked across at Nate with an expression that had been carefully assembled to communicate disappointment. The practiced look of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of making other people feel small without raising her voice. Calvin looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Nate. Nate gave the smallest nod. Calvin said, without ceremony, that they could proceed. Constance spoke first. Of course she did. She began with a preamble about family and commitment and the kind of man Priya deserved. And somewhere in the 3rd sentence, the preamble became something sharper. An accounting of Nate's inadequacies delivered in the measured tone of a woman reading from a list she had memorized. He had never truly understood what Priya had given up. He had never matched the life she was accustomed to. He had done well enough considering, but there was a limit to what patience could sustain, and surely Nate, if he was being honest with himself, understood that this outcome was not a failure of Priya's character, but a recognition of incompatibility that had been visible from the beginning. She finished. She folded her hands. She sat back with the composed satisfaction of someone who had just delivered a closing argument. Nate let the silence sit for a full 3 seconds. Then he spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He kept his hands flat on the table, and he spoke the way he ran a department meeting, methodically from the beginning, without decoration. He said, 4 years ago, Constance's catering business collapsed. He said it plainly, the way you state a fact about weather. The credit destruction that followed was severe enough that the refinancing on the Goodlet Farms Parkway property, $618,000, could not be approved without a primary borrower whose financials were sound. Priya had come to him. She had cried. She had asked him to save her family's home, and he had said yes, without hesitation, because that was the kind of man he was. He had signed as primary borrower, not co-borrower, primary. His name, his credit, his legal exposure. carried quietly for 4 years while Constance hosted garden parties and introduced him to her friends as the man who worked in schools. He paused. He said, 3 years ago, when Priya's credit inquiry flagged during the application for the Pembroke Lane rental, the lease had been signed by him alone, solely. Priya's name appeared on a secondary form with no legal standing. The lease agreement, paragraph 11, subclause B, specified that no additional occupants could be introduced without the written consent of the primary leaseholder. Winston Beaumont had moved in without that consent. The property management company had been notified accordingly. He paused again. He said, the divorce filing had triggered a mandatory review clause in the First Tennessee refinancing agreement. That review had initiated an audit. The audit had identified a material inaccuracy in the original application, a rental property listed as unencumbered income that carried an undisclosed lien. A compliance referral had been issued. A demand letter had been sent to Constance personally. The home sale she had been planning, the $280,000 in equity she had been counting on for her retirement, could not proceed without his written consent, and the compliance matter would need to be resolved before any transaction was possible. He paused one final time. Then he looked directly at Constance Holloway, and he said it. You spent 4 years treating me like I was beneath this family, but what you didn't know was that your whole house, in every sense of the word, was standing on my name. The room was completely still. Constance's composure did not shatter. It simply left, like a coat sliding from a hanger, quietly, without drama. The garden party version of her, the assembled, performing, verdict-delivering version, was gone, and what remained was a woman sitting very still in a conference room chair, her hands no longer folded, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere on the table that held no answers. Priya said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had known some of this, she had not known all of it, and the full picture, laid out in Nate's measured, unhurried voice, had the particular devastation of something that could not be undisputed or redirected or survived, with dignity, intact. Calvin placed 2 documents in front of Nate. Nate read both, signed both, and set the pen down. He stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up nothing from the table because he had brought nothing to the table that belonged there. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the hallway without looking back. The elevator opened immediately, as if it had been waiting. He stepped in, and the doors closed behind him, and by the time he reached the lobby and pushed through the glass doors into the Memphis afternoon, the sun was high and the air smelled like cut grass from the median strip on Madison Avenue, and Nathaniel Cross walked to his truck, feeling, for the first time in 4 years, exactly like himself. What happened next to the Holloways took another 8 months to fully unfold, and every month brought something new and irreversible. The compliance inquiry moved through First Tennessee Bank's internal process with the slow, grinding certainty of institutional machinery that does not hurry and does not stop. The material inaccuracy in the original refinancing application of the undisclosed lien on the rental property listed as unencumbered income was documented, reviewed, and referred to the bank's legal department. Constance hired an attorney. The attorney negotiated. At the end of it, Constance Holloway signed a settlement agreement and wrote a check for $41,000 in penalties and fees to resolve the matter without further proceedings. She did not discuss it publicly. She did not discuss it with her social circle. She had no choice but to pay it, and the paying of it was a quiet devastation that left a mark no garden party could cover. The home sale came next. With the compliance matter resolved and the divorce settlement finalized, Nate granted his written consent for the Goodlet Farms Parkway property to be listed. By then, Constance's timeline had collapsed. The realtor she had originally engaged had moved on to other clients. The market window she had been counting on had shifted. The home sold 4 months after the mediation at a price $47,000 below the figure Constance had told her friends she expected. The $280,000 equity cash-out she had been quietly planning. As the foundation of her retirement became something considerably smaller, considerably more complicated, and surrounded by circumstances she could not explain to anyone without revealing things she had no intention of revealing, she moved into a townhouse in Germantown. The spring garden party did not happen that year. It did not happen the year after either. The invitations stopped coming gradually, the way invitations always stop when the house that anchored the gatherings is gone and the woman giving them seems, somehow, diminished. Constance's social circle did not abandon her loudly. It simply contracted quietly, the way expensive things do when the appearance of abundance can no longer be maintained. Priya relocated to a one-bedroom apartment in Midtown. She found it herself, applied in her own name, and was approved without complication. Her credit had recovered enough in the years since the original inquiry. She did not reach out to Nate. He did not reach out to her. Winston Beaumont had not resurfaced. His network in Memphis had quietly been told he was based elsewhere now. No one pressed the question. Nate Cross went back to work the Monday after the mediation and ran his department the same way he always had. Department meetings at 8, coaches held to their schedules, facilities maintained, kids showing up to Saturday Open Gym because he had never once cancelled it. His colleagues noticed, over the weeks that followed, that he seemed lighter, not happier in any loud announced way, just lighter. The particular weight that a patient man carries when he has been carrying something too long, that weight was gone. His shoulders sat differently. He laughed more easily at things that deserved to be laughed at. The divorce settlement provided him a sum that, added to what he had already been building quietly in savings, gave him real options. He considered them carefully, the way he considered everything, and then he did what felt most true to who he was. He established the Cross Foundation. Its first program was a summer athletics initiative covering AAU registration fees, travel costs, and equipment for 40 Memphis kids who could not afford to participate without help. He announced it at a booster meeting without fanfare, posted the application on the school's community board, and within 3 weeks had more applicants than spots. He funded a second cohort 6 months later. The kids who came through the program were the same kids he had been showing up for every Saturday morning for years. The ones who arrived early and stayed late and had nobody telling them they were worth investing in. He told them, through every dollar spent and every Saturday shown up for, that they were. It was at one of those Saturday sessions in the fall of the following year that he met Imani Sellers properly. She had been volunteering at the rec center for months, running a movement and injury prevention workshop for the teenage athletes in the adjoining gym. He had seen her in passing, a steady presence, unhurried, focused on what she was doing rather than who was watching her do it. One Saturday morning in October, she asked him a question about one of his kids who had been favoring his left knee, and they stood in the hallway outside the gym and talked about it for 20 minutes in the way that people talk when they are both genuinely interested in the same thing. She was direct and warm and honest, and she laughed at something he said with a completeness that had no performance in it whatsoever. He asked if she wanted to get coffee sometime. She said yes without making it complicated. There is a lesson in what Nate Cross did and did not do over those 4 years and everything that followed. He signed his name to things in love, in good faith, without calculation or expectation of return. That was not weakness. It was never weakness. But the envelope on the hall table, the documents inside it, the name printed plainly at the top, those things did not disappear because nobody talked about them. Legal reality is not sentimental. It does not care who said thank you and who did not. It simply holds steady and permanent until someone finally decides to read what it says. Know what you have signed, know what your name means, and understand that the people who dismissed you most confidently are often the ones most completely dependent on something you control. That envelope is still in Nate's desk drawer at Whitehaven High School, filed between a budget report and a facilities calendar. He does not look at it often. He does not need to. It is not there to remind him of the pain. It is there because it is proof, plain, legal, permanent proof, that he was never what they said he was. So tell me, what would you have done in Nate's position? Would you have walked out that door with the envelope? Would you have opened it? And when Calvin laid those two documents on the table and told you to choose, what would you have chosen? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because I want to know what you would have done. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button before you go. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to hear stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, join us right now, because we have more stories coming, and every single one of them delivers. I will see you in the next one. You